IMF's Executive Director, Kristalina Georgieva, ahead of the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF in Marrakech, Morocco, this week announced the appointment of a third executive director to represent Sub-Saharan Africa at the IMF. To put this new development in context, it is well known that African countries did not take part in designing the current international financial architecture, which was designed by global North economies during the era of colonialism. Almost 80 years after the establishment of the IMF and World Bank, the question of the voice and representation of African countries in global economic decision-making remains critical and cannot be divorced from the unfair governance structures of these institutions. Let's take a quick look at how the IMF works. Quotas primarily determine the IMF's decision-making power. Put simply, a country's quota, calculated by its economic prowess, influences its financial contribution, borrowing capacity, and crucially, its voting power. Despite being home to 54 countries, as recognized by the UN, and over a billion people, Africa currently holds just 6.47% of the voting rights at the IMF, starkly contrasted by the United States, which alone wields a hefty 16.5%. With the 16th General Review of the IMF quotas concluding in December 2023, the conversation heats up around equitable representation and decision-making power. Yet, is adding a third executive director for 45 sub-Saharan African countries enough? While each of the three directors will now represent 15 African countries. Powerful economies like the US, Japan, China, and more have their individual directors, pointing towards an apparent disparity. But there's a deeper issue. The 45 African countries only command a mere 4.64% voting power, prompting a vital question: is a new director enough without meaningful quota reform? Reforms have occurred in the past, reflecting the rise of emerging economies like Brazil, India, and China. Yet, with an economic weight leaning towards affluent countries, low-income African countries find themselves at a disadvantage. Quotas are also key in determining the allocation of special drawing rights, SDRs. This explains why from a $650 billion SDR allocation in 2021 post-COVID-19, African countries received only $34 billion, underscoring the pressing need to reassess quota shares and for representation to be truly equitable. As the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network has previously stated, enhancement of the IMF quotas of low-income countries to amplify their voice in its decision-making, regardless of their economic weight, is the more meaningful option. This is important because the IMF plays a dominant role in shaping the economies of these disenfranchised countries through its lending and surveillance, typically requiring the adoption of harsh austerity measures. Recent research supports this point, showing that 117 of 275 completed IMF loan programs over the past 20 years were in sub-Saharan Africa, compared to only 7 in advanced countries. African economies stand to be disadvantaged by a quota adjustment based primarily on economic weight. Even though the fund pledges to protect the quota of low-income countries, this is insufficient to increase the say of African countries in the operations and policies of the IMF. The African Sovereign Debt Justice Network argues that now is the opportune time to reevaluate, ensuring that African nations have a genuinely impactful voice within the IMF. It's not merely about quota reforms but redefining a more just global financial architecture. For more insights on this development, please read the statement of the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network on the occasion of the World Bank Group IMF annual meetings. You can find this statement on our website afronomislaw.org. What are your thoughts on the IMF's quota reforms and its implications for Africa? Share your insights in the comments below, and remember, to stay informed on global financial matters, keep it locked right here by subscribing.